Deep in the heart of France is a mountain whose peak is now covered in woodland. Yet it's here that over 2,000 years ago, a powerful Gallic people built their capital, Bibracte. There were hundreds of dwellings and workshops, public buildings, prestigious houses. Bibracte had over 10,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in Gaul.
It's as if the settlement was fossilized beneath the tree's roots.
Thanks to excavations carried out over several decades and new imaging techniques, archaeologists have discovered that some of the buildings were directly inspired by the most prestigious buildings in ancient Rome.
Unfortunately, none of the building's foundations remain. In spite of that, we've been able to roughly piece together its appearance.
You really get the impression that this domus was bought off catalog. The person who had it built wanted the very best of what was being done in Italy at the time.
There was a double circle of ramparts to protect the site, an immense forum in the heart of the settlement, like in the biggest Roman cities, an ingenious system to manage the water for the thermi. Thanks to a reconstitution of the city when it was at its peak, you will discover why Bibracte was unique and why its inhabitants suddenly deserted it. This is Bibracte, the Gallic capital admired by Julius Caesar, which was the first to enter the Gallo-Roman era over 2,000 years ago. In the 1st century BC, people who considered themselves Celts occupied a vast zone that stretched from the Atlantic to Central Europe. Solely to the west of the Rhine, there were probably around 10 million individuals divided up into around 60 tribes. They did not obey the same chief, nor did they speak the same dialect. They did not form a nation, and yet they belonged to the same cultural community that we are accustomed to calling the Gauls. Among them was a particularly rich and powerful people, the Aedui.
The Aedui's location in the middle of Gaul made them natural intermediaries between the Romans on the one side in the lands towards the Mediterranean and the other peoples of Gaul in the land stretching out to the Rhine. And that was most certainly a great advantage for them, politically of course, but it also brought them great subsidies of a financial nature, in particular from the sale of wine, and why not from the sale of slaves or various materials. That was most certainly one of the sources of the Aedui's wealth.
Their vast territory, which was ideally situated between the Saône and the Loire, facilitated trade at a time when rivers were the main routes of communication.
We know that the Romans were very interested in Aedui's strategic position on these communication routes to the extent that they signed a military alliance treaty, and it was very, very rare for the Romans to sign such treaties. So we can see how important they considered the Aedui to be.
And it was in the Morvan, in the vast heart of the territory, on Mont Bouvray, that the Aedui would prove their expertise and resourcefulness in building their capital, Bibracte. For 2,000 years, Bibracte remained there, dormant, invisible to all, beneath the vegetation of the thick beech forest. The first remains were discovered there a century and a half ago, and since then, archaeologists have unearthed countless traces left by the Gauls. Hundreds of thousands of objects, remains of dwellings, of water supply systems, and even the vestiges of exceptionally large buildings.
One of the main challenges for us was to detect the remains of a major archaeological site that had been fully preserved beneath the forest. What is the most interesting for us is that there has been very little subsequent reoccupation to disturb the constructions from the Gallic period, which makes Bibracte an observatory of Gallic society that is practically unique in France and in Europe.
According to Julius Caesar himself, Bibracte was the largest and most important oppidum in the Aedui territory.
Oppidum is a Latin word regularly used by Caesar to define the Gauls' fortified settlements. So for convenience, archaeologists decided to keep Caesar's term.
The Aedui settled here because the site offers a number of advantages. Mont Bouvray culminates at 820 meters above sea level, has extremely steep slopes, and is difficult to access. Above all, its summit can accommodate a large population at high altitude.
It's an absolutely remarkable belvedere that looks out over gigantic landscapes that stretch out for up to 200 kilometers as far as the Alps, that allows you to immediately understand why the Aedui chose to settle on this hill. It is in fact because they had an impression that they were on the top of the world. There were definitely military considerations behind their settlement here in a period that was visibly unsettled.
The site covers 200 hectares. That's the equivalent of 300 football pitches. And for several decades, archaeologists have been trying to discover what Bibracte looked like at the peak of its splendor.
The settlement was immense, 200 hectares. That's almost 2 kilometers from one end to the other, without counting the areas beyond the fortifications. So there's no way we can excavate everything. That would take hundreds of years. Gradually, a certain number of techniques have appeared that allow us, to a certain extent, to understand what is buried below without having to move the earth.
Among these innovative and non-invasive techniques is LIDAR surveying. Contrary to radar, which uses radio waves, LIDAR uses light waves from a laser. With this technology on board an airplane, we can see the exact and detailed variations in a site's topography.
What's interesting with this sort of survey is that it allows us to obtain a detailed image of the topography beneath the forest canopy, meaning below the vegetation, under the trees. So what is impossible to see from a traditional aerial image suddenly becomes fully visible. You can clearly see the relief, the valleys, the summits, the peaks of Mont Bouvray, but also a whole set of anomalies, corresponding to the archaeological remains that are preserved and fossilized in the form of micro-reliefs beneath the current vegetation. In particular, the confirmation of the layout of Bibracte's fortifications, that we can see very clearly in the shape of these lineaments. But we were also able to map out precisely a whole area of ledges and terraces that are zones that were much more conducive to the installation of Gallic period constructions and of the settlement's monumental architecture in the main occupied areas of Bibracte.
Whereas the first excavations showed that Bibracte was surrounded by 5 kilometers of fortifications, LIDAR surveying revealed that the fortification system was in fact much more complex. Initially, another fortification, the founding act of the oppidum, ran for over 7 kilometers.
The outer wall, the longest one, is older than the inner wall, and the inner wall is most likely a reduction of the outer wall, probably for military reasons.
The aim was probably to reduce the area to be defended by decreasing the oppidum's surface from 200 to 135 hectares.
Bibracte was most probably one of the first Celtic oppida that Caesar discovered when he started his military campaigns, precisely in 58 BC. You have to imagine that the settlement was visible from a great distance, at least 30 kilometers away. It was a settlement perched up on its hill and surrounded by fortifications. As you drew closer, you could see the very unusual style of the ramparts.
The archaeologists were astonished to find themselves with a construction precisely described by Julius Caesar himself in his Commentaries on the Gallic War that he wrote, in part, at Bibracte. He called this structure Murus Gallicus, the Gallic Wall. The Murus Gallicus is generally built in the following fashion. Straight beams are placed at equal distance from each other, 2 feet apart, on the ground, perpendicular to the direction of the wall. They are linked together and covered with plenty of earth. Large stones that make up the cladding close up the intervals. With the first row held firmly in place, another similar row is positioned above it, and so on until the wall reaches the desired height. The archaeologists reproduced a section of this Gallic wall in order to better comprehend the building technique used.
The wooden lattice would be able to support blows from a battering ram without moving. It's very difficult to dismantle the rampart by tunneling beneath it. And finally, fire would have very little effect because the wood was buried in a mass of earth and was protected behind a wall of stones.
On the southwestern tip of the settlement, an excavation team is carrying out new research on the rampart. The scientific goal is to gain greater understanding of the settlement's defense mechanism.
What we have discovered here at the Great Gates is that the rampart wasn't the only element of fortification. It was, in fact, a part of an enormous, wide-scale defense mechanism that was a system made up of glacis, which are artificial slopes used to create a sort of no-man's land. And that's very important because it's a defense system that is over 100 meters in depth, whereas the rampart itself measures only 10 meters in depth.
The construction of these long fortifications required large quantities of material and a considerable workforce. And the topography of Montbouvray immensely complicated the implementation of this project.
According to our criteria, you can consider that there couldn't have been a worse place in Aedoui's territory to build a capital. With extremely few natural agricultural and pastoral resources on site, they would have had to bring everything here to do that, and they had to come up slopes with a drop of 150 to 200 meters.
This was a colossal undertaking to go about in mountain territory. It would have required highly elaborate political and social organization, with engineers, architects, foremen capable of organizing works all year long, with the transport of all the material, the construction of routes to bring all those materials in, as we see today in public works. You have to imagine something along the same lines, but with thousands of workers. With regard to the earth and stones, there were plenty to be found on Montbouvray, so they could source those here. On the other hand, with regard to the wood, that was most certainly purchased elsewhere, because as we know from recent studies, there was no forest like there is today. The terrain was bare.
But the Gallic builders' fierce determination and the lavish means employed can't just be justified by military reasons.
These fortifications, these great monumental constructions, were obviously built for defensive purposes, but also to lend prestige to the site. These murus Gallicus were built to be striking. Indeed, Caesar even wrote, "It is not unpleasant to behold."
And it is certainly through long and relentlessly hard work that the Aedui managed to build these defensive ramparts, a symbol of their might and their prestige. Around 15 gates were built to allow entry to the oppidum. The most imposing one was on the northeast side of the settlement, the Rabu Gate.
It was built in exactly the same fashion as the ramparts. It is the largest door at the oppidum of Bibracte, 20 meters wide and of monumental appearance.
On top of its exceptional width, this gate is also remarkable because of the two asymmetrical bastions that flank it.
Gates like Rabu Gate were probably constantly guarded. It's the bastions that allow us to imagine that. Because these bastions are like great solid towers on top of which there must have been a terrace or a walkway for the guards.
Excavations have shown that Rabu Gate was rebuilt several times, which shows the evolution of the Aedouis' preoccupations over time.
So, for example, they needed to raise the ramparts slightly to raise the gates, dig trenches that weren't always there in front of the gates.
Widening the gate, which facilitated the passing of pedestrians and carts, shows that it was the utilitarian aspect and prestige that finally triumphed over defensive concerns. In 58 BC, the Gallic Wars commenced, an 8-year-long series of military campaigns led by Julius Caesar and his legions. The Roman general achieved a difficult victory after several deadly battles, including that of Alesia, where the confederation of Gallic tribes led by Vercingetorix surrendered. From then on, the whole of Gaul was under Roman dominance. Still considered as Roman allies, the Aedui and their capital prospered. And great change took place. In particular, in building style, where Roman influence gained foothold. The proof of that would come in the shape of an astonishing discovery that the archaeologists would unearth on a plateau called the Horse Park. Here, the archaeologists have excavated the remains of what they call a domus. It is a luxurious house of over 3,500 square meters that was probably occupied by an important member of the Gallic aristocracy.
A domus is a townhouse occupied by the upper classes. A house with a strict layout that would correspond to certain norms, which were those of Roman tradition in Italy. The domus we found here is typical of the style of Roman house that could have been found in Pompeii, for example.
It was veritable urban palace, 55 meters long, 70 meters wide. Its axial layout would scrumptiously respect a model devised in central Italy, with just behind the entryway a courtyard extended by an office where the master of the house would welcome his clients. Behind that, the private space was organized around a courtyard surrounded by a colonnade, leading to the main reception room. A service corridor ran parallel to the perimeter corridor. On the east side, a gallery led to other reception rooms that looked out onto a garden with a spring. The reception rooms were adorned with mosaics, wall paintings, and richly decorated ceilings. These elements of decoration suffice to show that this domus was as refined as any of its Italian counterparts.
The Great Domus is astounding. You really get the impression that this domus was bought off catalog. The person who had it built wanted the very best of what was being done in Italy at the time. That means that he went to Rome to find a foreman, an architect, and craftsman. In a way, you could say that this domus is a political manifesto. The person who had it built was certainly a top-ranking member of the elite who wanted this building to show that he fully adhered to the Roman Empire's political project.
This domus also provided the most modern comforts of the time. In particular, hot baths, heated through a boiler room system that was part of a vast kitchen. There were amenities that allowed the owners to enjoy a luxury hitherto unknown to the Gauls: the use of water for relaxation.
Water was really a part of the Roman way of life, with the most distinctive element, hot baths. Every aristocratic house had to be equipped with what was the ancestor of the sauna. And for the Gauls, it was something entirely new and exotic to be able to equip your home with such an amenity.
But there were more surprises in store for the archaeologists. They would make yet another, even more astonishing discovery about the ongoing Romanization of Bibracte. It would take place in the heart of the oppidum, on a vast plateau that the archaeologists call the pasture of the convent, as monks settled here at the end of the Middle Ages. This central zone was, without a doubt, the busiest neighborhood of Bibracte. That is why, for 2 decades, it became one of the most important excavation sites.
One of the main discoveries was the excavation of the oldest piece of Roman architecture in Bibracte, dating from the middle of the 1st century BC, probably just after the Gallic Wars. It was a great surprise for the archaeologists to discover such an ancient and extremely impressive and monumental group of structures with its very sophisticated architecture that is typical of the Roman world.
For the archaeologists, there was no doubt that they had just found a veritable Roman forum.
A forum is the town's main square, the beating heart of a Roman city, and that's where all the main activities would take place. Religious activities, political activities, and markets were held in the forum. It is located at the crossing of the 2 main thoroughfares.
At first, the archaeologists excavated the remains of a large building that they believed to be an aristocratic house. But what they found next led them to change their minds. Effectively, the underground surveys carried out beneath this building revealed a spectacular and unusual element belonging to an older building: the base of a white limestone column still standing in its original position. This column base was resting on a retaining wall. Gradually, they uncovered more sections of the same wall that made up a large rectangle. And at regular intervals, there were the imprints from columns that had been ripped out. The archaeologists believed that these remains could only be those of a very large public building. By putting all those elements together, including the dimension of the large central room, 22 meters by 14, and the architectural elements found on site, the column, the collapsed roof, and other elements, the archaeologists recreated a rectangular room surrounded by a colonnade which formed a central nave. That nave had a covered raised gallery. This configuration allowed them to suggest the building could be assimilated to a Roman basilica, of the sort found in forums in Roman towns in Italy, and that were used as citizens' meeting places, as tribunals and stock exchanges. This basilica also had the particularity of being inside an even larger multifunctional complex.
This central room was in the middle of a much larger, much more vast complex that was flanked by two open courtyards and had an open gallery, possibly housing boutiques all along the side facing the main road.
Just next to this complex, on the corner of the street to be precise, the archaeologists also excavated an unusual fountain that confirmed their hypothesis.
It is a fountain in the shape of a ship. This unusual shape must have drawn attention to this site. As you can imagine, there were all these boutiques at the entry to the forum. There were a lot of activities going on inside. And there were lots of people coming and going around this main square, and so there was a need for an abundant water supply. And the very shape of this fountain, this great ship, turned this place into a monument, and so it was an important meeting point for the settlement.
The existence of this forum confirms that this neighborhood was very much the beating heart of the Aedouis capital.
This building was effectively in the heart of the settlement, on the main road, Bibracte's main avenue, between Rabu Gate and the Great Gates, and was therefore in the powerful heart of the Roman settlement of Bibracte.
That shows the arrival in the settlement of a new pole of activities with a new function. And this new function is very clear. In every community organized in Roman style, the Roman forum was the center of life. So, very clearly, the Aedui had reorganized public life, at least in part, to correspond to Roman modes, as of the middle of the 1st century BC, and so, therefore, 3 or 4 decades before this modus operandi became common in Roman Gaul.
Architecture implies and brings with it new ways of behaving in society and of organizing your personal and political life. Behaviors and social practices that were linked to what was, for the Celts, a new type of society, that of the Romans.
Among the various Roman processes acquired by the Aedui was that of water management.
It's really not by chance that the Aedui settled here, because there is a huge amount of water, plenty to meet the needs of the population of a large settlement.
Geographical reasons explain this abundance. As they come up against the peaks of the Morvan, the hot and humid masses of air coming from the Atlantic rapidly rise in altitude. And as they do that, they cool, and the water vapor they contain condense into droplets. The clouds formed by the droplets give rise to abundant rains that penetrate deep into the ground. When the subsoil reaches saturation point, the water surfaces in the form of springs or streams.
In the oppidum, 17 springs have been identified that were developed to deal with the population's water requirements. That could be in the form of public fountains or wells.
One of the finest examples is St. Pierre Fountain. Nestling at the head of a small valley, it draws on Bibracte's most abundant spring. Supply channels leading from the spring were laid down first, before a 20-meter by 10-meter stone basin was built. Then, a few decades later, 2 other retention ponds and various water channels were added.
The Romans were used to managing clean and wastewater. They were experts. That wasn't the case of the Gauls. We can see that in the setup of Saint-Pierre Fountain. There's a change in the system that demonstrates this Romanization.
This new knowledge was revealed to the archaeologists through the presence of other public fountains and buried water channel. The water was collected and conveyed to the heart of the settlement by means of channels made out of stone, or pipes made from wood or lead. They conveyed water to the basins or thermal baths in the wealthy homes of aristocrats. So, even before the Aedui became a part of the Roman Empire, Bibracte fully asserted itself as a Roman settlement. Alongside these luxurious Roman homes were more modern wooden-framed houses. Thus, behind Rabu Gate, excavations have revealed the traces left by cramped houses tightly lined up along a great avenue that ran all the way through the oppidum. Vast neighborhoods filled the plateau and gentler slopes around this central avenue. It's estimated that at its peak, the settlement was a home to up to 10,000 people.
The Gaelic houses were made of wood, so the frames were made of wood, the roofs, and a good part of the walls were entirely made out of wood, which is something that is very rarely conserved. So these houses didn't withstand the test of time, and that makes it particularly complicated to study them. Studying wooden architecture is a little like carrying out a police investigation. It's very different from the approach you can have, for example, when you study stone architecture, where the foundations and the base of the walls are easily conserved. Wood, of course, disintegrates over time, but you discover a certain number of clues that are often quite patchy or incomplete, and you have to try to bring all those clues together. It's like piecing together a puzzle. You can look at the post holes or other traces left by the other elements of these frames that were anchored into the ground. They are traces that can seem very enigmatic at first sight, but that, once they are analyzed, can really give us an idea of the house's layout, almost like an architect's plan.
And to make the archaeologists' work easier, a lot of the vestiges found are linked to fires in the houses, which were very frequent. As, contrary to what we could think, those fires were providential.
When these fires took place, you imagine the houses would burn, collapsing partially, and some of the rooms, as they were carbonized, would be preserved. Gradually, the fire would die down and disappear. There was no more oxygen. The combustion would be partial. And so what we find on architectural sites is that partially conserved wood. So there'll be fragments, pieces of foundations, beams, bits of wood from totally collapsed walls lying flat, and that are preserved because the following occupants level the ground and build on top. And when we excavate, we inevitably find all the different states of construction with these fire levels, sometimes in optimal states of conservation.
The fragile wooden remains can also be conserved in water when they are buried in sediments from springs or wells.
In water, the absence of oxygen will in part limit the development of bacteria, of mold, that would attack the wood. And in that sort of context, the wood is protected and will be extremely well conserved. That also has the advantage, contrary to carbonized wood, of leaving certain tool marks that allow us to determine very simply how the wood was crafted.
And that is how, by carrying out excavations in the sediments of a spring, that the archaeologists made an exceptional discovery.
The most surprising wooden architectural elements we found in Bibracte, and that is unique in the Celtic world, is undoubtedly this oak post with its carved pattern. It is an exceptional testimony to the expertise of Gallic craftsmen and also shows us the aesthetic of this architecture, which must have been very, very ornate.
Using all these clues, the archaeologists aim to recreate the appearance of Gallic houses. As a rule, the houses were small, 20 to 30 square meters and rectangular in shape. Squared oak posts, driven into the ground, served as a frame for walls made of planks or of woven branches coated in clay. The houses often had a cellar. They also had an upper floor and could reach 10 meters in height. Their slanted roofs were covered in wooden tiles called shingles. Inside, there was generally one multifunctional room with a central hearth around which life was organized. The furniture was mainly made of wood, as were the daily utensils, including crockery. As they searched further, the archaeologists discovered that wood was a resource that was used in a very rational way.
We can effectively already talk of standardization of housing. We have noticed that most of the houses followed the same design. All of these houses were made of oak, which is a species that is not present on the site, but only in the neighboring territories. When you wanted to build a house, you'd buy wood from a merchant, who would also be part of a timber commerce, who would provide the oppidum with wood for construction from the forest, with squared beams, planks, and wooden tiles. And that explains also how come all the wood was prepared in advance. So their dimensions were pretty much standardized, and that is something we have found all over the site.
For a long time, the wooden buildings found in Bibracte were limited to simple houses, which cast doubt on the existence of public architecture specific to the Celts. But a short time ago, to their great surprise, the archaeologists excavated an exceptional group of structures built out of wood, occupying a vast plateau near to the Great Domus.
In the plot where we are, we found a huge building measuring around 45 meters in circumference, with around 110 to 120 posts supporting a sort of sheltered area surrounding a courtyard. We think that this sheltered area was a public building that was erected around 60 to 50 BC, that is, before the arrival of the Romans. And that building is very rare, but above all, it is in the heart of the settlement.
In spite of the shortage of evidence found, the archaeologists would try to make sense of them in order to recreate the building's shape.
Unfortunately, the building we excavated has no more foundations. All that remains are the post holes. In spite of that, those post holes allow us to very precisely reconstitute the building's layout during the different phases. And also, thanks to various details, such as, in particular, where the rain fell, we have been able to reconstitute the roof overhangs, so we can see where the passageways were and reconstitute its appearance.
They would have flattened the land first, by accumulating backfill behind a retaining wall, using the Murus Gallicus technique. Then, a wooden gallery was built, surrounding a central courtyard with two opposing entrances. In the absence of terracotta roof tiles, we can imagine a thatched or wooden shingle roof. During a first reconstruction, a centrally positioned covered hall replaced the surrounding gallery. Later still, the retaining wall was rebuilt in stonework in the Roman style, whilst the covered hall was also rebuilt. Stone foundations replaced the posts anchored into the ground. This building was bordered by streets of around 6 meters in width that separated it from the living quarters.
It's very difficult to know exactly what the purpose of this building was. The reason for that is simple. It's a public building, so there are no rubbish bins. No rubbish bins means no refuse to allow us to identify what was produced or took place here. In other settlements, we found relatively similar buildings, for example, in the oppidum in Corinth built by the Aedui. We know that this shape of building can be quite versatile. There's a relatively narrow door, but a large inner courtyard and large covered spaces. Was it used for public monuments, political purposes, for trade? The peculiarity is that we found a lot of coins in the ground, so we have the impression that there was a lot of trading going on here. In spite of that, we could never know if it was a marketplace or just a gathering place where people had holes in their pocket.
If archaeology manages to find the places where men lived, it sometimes has difficulty reconstituting how they lived there, in the absence of any written evidence. And the purpose of such an exceptional building remains to be clarified. But Bibracte was not just a prestigious citadel and the capital of the Aedui. It was also a major production site and trading settlement open to the world. The numerous metal workshops discovered in almost every sector of the oppidum bear witness to intense activity. All of the workshops have yet another surprising characteristic. They are built to the same standard plan. A wooden frame split into 2 rooms of the same size. At the back, a very dark, windowless room where even the ground was deliberately blackened. It was used for heating metal. The darkness and the craftsman's expertise allowed him to work the metal at the right time by using its color to assess the metal's temperature. To the front, looking out onto the street, was another space with a lighter floor which benefited from the daylight. Workstations were set up there to finish off and sell the objects.
These people processed the iron that was produced elsewhere, probably in the northern part. The iron arrived in the shape of bars or blocks of metal, and it were turned into tools, weapons, and various objects. They were good ironsmiths, but we know that that was the case of the Gauls in general. On the other hand, it's interesting to note that they also specialized in producing small objects, such as fibulae.
A fibula is a small everyday object used to hold clothes in place. So it was both functional and the decorative aspect was very important. The wearer would be showing his status society. What is interesting with this object is that during the 1st century, it would start to be mass-produced.
Bibracte's iron and bronze workers showed great expertise. The archaeologists have shown that they used clay molds that allowed them to make between 10 and 12 similar fibula at once. But to keep these workshops going, the necessary resources had to be found. In particular, metal.
In Aedui territory, we're on an old mountain range made up of ancient granite, formed during the Paleozoic era. And in that, to the north, we find iron, and to the south, we find non-ferrous metals, precious metals, silver, together with lead and zinc. And we also find tin, which remains a rare metal. They used the metals most commonly found on their territory to make objects that made Bibracte prosperous.
To fire the ovens, they needed to bring in a large quantity of combustibles, namely charcoal. Wood was a vital resource for the Bibracte's inhabitants because they used it in their workshops, to build their homes, and also for heating.
Today, it's hard for us to imagine how important wood could be for these ancient societies. They must have had a way of managing this resource so that it would always be available. Otherwise, their economy would collapse, as wood was central to that economy.
Bibracte was the place where most of the wealth of the Aedui was concentrated. They specialized in the production of any and all of the metal objects that were in use at the time on a very considerable scale, which shows that clients came from throughout Aedui's territory and probably beyond. So, for that reason, Bibracte was an important economic site where objects made there or objects that had come from much farther away than the Mediterranean would be redistributed towards a very large Gallic territory, and in particular the north.
But suddenly, in around 15 AD, the Aedui decided to permanently leave Bibracte, their capital. They went and settled about 20 kilometers away in Augustodonum, a new town founded by Roman Emperor Augustus and located on a new major road through Gaul. Later, the town would come to be called Autun. The Aedui's new capital would be developed there on flat land that was more conducive to the development of a Roman city with its monumental constructions.
The Aedui wanted to live in a Roman-style city. They felt Roman. And at the end of the day, Bibracte was a sort of symbol of a bygone era.
This move from Bibracte was the most spectacular sign of a change in era.
Celtic civilization died out once and for all, and the Gallo-Roman era commenced. It would last 4 centuries and leave a lasting mark on the history of this land, which 1,000 years later would become France. After the departure of the Aedui, the forest would cover Bibracte, plunging the settlement into oblivion. It would be rediscovered 2,000 years later, and since then, European archaeological teams have carried out excavations in search of the remains of this lost Gallic capital.
We've barely excavated 5% of Bibracte, and you could imagine that we know what's most important as we have a relatively complete map. And yet I'm certain that when we carry out further excavations next year or in 2 years, we shall find other sorts of buildings, other levels that will reveal another still unknown part of Gallic civilization.
There's enough to keep the archaeologist busy for hundreds of years.
In spite of the harsh climate and the lie of the land, the Aedui managed to establish a prestigious capital on Montbourg. Thanks to their organization, to the way they used natural resources, and their ingenuity, they succeeded in building and transforming the greatest and most imposing oppidum of all Gaul.
It was a shift that happened in a very short time span, 3 generations, a few decades, at a time when these regions of Celtic Europe were being swallowed up by the Roman Empire. From that point of view, Bibracte is a unique testimony to an extremely important time in Europe's history.
But a century after it came out of oblivion, Bibracte is still far from having revealed all its secrets. Excavation upon excavation, the archaeologists tirelessly question the subsoil of Montbourg in order to write the history of this civilization, which 2,000 years ago defined Europe's landscape and roots.